Once upon a time, in a land of golden palaces and endless worries, there lived a mighty king. Though he had wealth, power, and loyal subjects, peace always slipped through his grasp. His heart remained restless, heavy with ambition and fear. One evening, a humble Buddhist monk entered the palace. With nothing more than a calm smile and the gentle strength of compassion, the monk revealed to the king a truth far greater than any treasure, that real peace is not found in power, but in kindness and understanding. Tonight, as you listen to this timeless tale, allow the story to guide you beyond your daily worries, beyond the noise of thought and into a soft place of rest. Breathe slowly, let your body sink deeper into comfort, and imagine yourself in that quiet palace where wisdom shines brighter than gold. If this gentle journey helps you relax, find calm, and drift into sleep, I invite you to stay connected with us. Subscribe to Buddhism for Sleep and discover more bedtime stories of mindfulness, compassion, and peace. Together, we can build a sanctuary of rest where every night is an opportunity to heal, to dream, and to awaken to the kindness within. Close your eyes and let the story begin. Part 1. The Restless King. Once long ago, in a kingdom surrounded by mountains and rivers that shimmered in the morning light, there lived a king whose name was whispered with awe across his land. He ruled with a strong hand, and his word was law. His crown was heavy with gold, and his palace glistened with precious jewels. From the outside, he seemed to possess everything a human heart could desire: wealth beyond measure, soldiers loyal to his command, and subjects who bowed deeply whenever he passed. Yet inside his heart there was no rest. Each night, as the moon climbed high above the palace roofs, the king would lie awake upon his silken bed, staring at the ceiling carved with stars of ivory. Sleep escaped him. No matter how many songs the musicians played or how many cups of sweet wine were poured to lull his mind, his thoughts chased him into the darkness like restless shadows that refused to be. Still, the king often wondered why his heart trembled, even in silence. He feared betrayal from his ministers, rebellion from his generals, and unrest from his people. He feared the loss of his riches, the weakening of his body, and the day when death might come to claim his throne. His crown felt less like a treasure and more like an iron weight pressing upon his soul. Though he commanded armies, he could not command his own peace. One evening, when the air outside was cool and the scent of jasmine drifted into the palace windows, the king walked alone in his garden. Lanterns flickered softly in the breeze, casting long shadows among the stones. He listened to the sound of water flowing from the marble fountain, yet even this gentle rhythm did not calm him. His mind was filled with questions. Why, with all the wealth of the world, did peace escape him? Why, with all his power, did he feel powerless against his own restless heart? As he paced among the trees, he heard the quiet steps of his advisor, an old man with hair as white as winter snow. The advisor bowed low and asked, "My king, what troubles you tonight?" The king sighed. "I have everything, yet nothing satisfies me. The crown upon my head brings no peace. The palace around me feels empty. Even my victories taste bitter. Tell me, old friend, is there anything in this world that can bring rest to a restless soul?" The advisor looked into the king's weary eyes and spoke softly. "There is a man, a wandering monk, who has been seen near the gates of the city. He wears no jewels, no fine robes. He owns nothing, yet he carries himself with the calm of a still lake. The people say that wherever he goes, hearts grow lighter. Perhaps, my king, it is worth hearing his words." The king frowned at the thought. How could a man who owned nothing know a truth that he, a ruler of nations, could not grasp? Yet something in his heart stirred with curiosity, for he longed for rest more than he longed for gold. "Bring this monk to me," the king ordered. "I shall see if there is any wisdom in his silence." The next morning, as the palace gates opened to the rising sun, the monk was brought before the throne. He was unlike any guest the king had ever received. His robes were simple, faded by years of travel. His feet were dusty from long paths. His face was calm, and his eyes held a depth that seemed to reflect the sky itself. When he bowed, it was not from fear or obligation, but from a gentle respect that asked for nothing in return. The king studied him for a long while, waiting for the monk to speak, but the monk remained silent, his breathing slow and steady. The silence itself filled the hall, softer than any music, yet strangely powerful. Finally, the king broke the stillness. "Monk, I have called you here because I cannot find peace. I have wealth, yet I am poor in rest. I have power, yet I am weak in spirit. Tell me, what is the secret of peace?" The monk lifted his gaze and replied with a voice as calm as flowing water. "Great king, peace is not hidden in palaces, nor locked away in treasure chests. It is not found in the applause of crowds or the fear of your enemies. Peace is like a flame within the heart. When guarded with compassion, it grows bright. When neglected, it flickers and fades." The king leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "Compassion? How can compassion help a ruler? Strength holds kingdoms together. Fear keeps men obedient. How can kindness protect a throne?" The monk smiled gently. "Strength may rule bodies, but it does not rule hearts. Fear may silence voices, but it does not win love. Compassion, when practiced, softens anger, heals wounds, and builds trust stronger than iron. Without compassion, even the greatest king is alone, surrounded by shadows." The hall grew quiet again, and the king felt an unfamiliar stirring inside him. The words of the monk sounded simple, yet they carried a weight that pierced deeper than any sword. Still, he resisted. "If compassion is so powerful, why do you wander without home or followers? Why do you own nothing? Should not such wisdom bring you riches and fame?" The monk closed his eyes for a moment before answering. "I wander because the world itself is my home. I own nothing because nothing truly belongs to me or to anyone. Riches come and go like leaves in the wind. Fame fades like footprints in the sand, but compassion remains. Wherever I go, it is with me, and in compassion I rest as though upon the softest bed." The king felt a strange calm settle over him as he listened. His worries, though still present, seemed lighter, as if they had loosened their grip. He thought of his sleepless nights, his endless fears, and he wondered whether compassion could indeed be the key he had been missing. Yet his pride whispered against the monk's words. Could it be so simple? That night, when the monk had been given a humble room in the palace, the king once again lay awake upon his grand bed, but this time his thoughts were not of war or betrayal. They were of the monk's calm face and his quiet voice. For For the first time in many years, the king's restless heart began to soften, just enough for sleep to drift near. As the moonlight painted silver upon the palace walls, the king's eyes slowly closed, and a question lingered in his dreams. Could compassion truly be the treasure he had been searching for all his life? And so began the journey of a king who sought peace not in gold or power, but in the gentle wisdom of compassion. The story had only just begun, and the lessons yet to come would change not only his life, but the life of his entire kingdom. Part to the whispers of the court in the days that followed the monk's arrival at the palace, the king felt something unusual stirring in his heart. The monk's words had not erased his worries entirely, but they had planted a seed, small and delicate, that began to grow each time the king remembered the calm tone and steady eyes of his guest. Yet outside the stillness of their conversations, the palace itself remained full of noise, of whispers, and of restless schemes. The royal court was a place where ambition thrived like vines upon old stone walls. Ministers competed for the king's favor. Generals boasted of victories yet to be won. Courtiers gossiped in hushed voices, their tongues sharper than daggers. Each man and woman sought their own advantage, each careful smile hiding secret desires. It was within this restless chamber that the king often sat, listening to petitions, settling disputes, and judging the endless quarrels of those who served him. But now, after hearing the monk speak of compassion, the king found himself seeing the court with new eyes. He noticed how quickly ministers turned against one another for a handful of gold. He saw the greed shining in the eyes of those who promised loyalty while plotting their own advancement. He heard the bitterness in voices that praised him with honeyed words yet carried envy beneath. Once, he might have ignored such things, considering them the natural ways of power. But now, he wondered, if compassion could soften hearts, then what of a palace ruled by greed and fear? One morning, as the king prepared to hear his counsel, the chamber was already alive with whispers. The courtiers bowed low as he entered, their robes sweeping across the marble floor. Behind their bows, their eyes darted, each measuring the others. The king seated himself upon the throne, its golden arms cool beneath his hands. The first minister stepped forward, a man known for his cunning tongue. "My lord," the minister began, "our neighboring kingdom grows restless. Their king gathers soldiers upon the border. We must strike before they do, to prove our strength and secure your name for generations." Another minister quickly rose, shaking his head. "No, my king. War drains the treasury. Instead, we must raise taxes upon the farmers, who grow fat while the palace bears the cost of defense. Let the peasants sacrifice, for they are many, while you are one." The murmurs of agreement and dissent filled the hall, voices weaving like a tangled net. The king sat silently, hearing not only their words but also the hunger beneath them. The hunger for wealth, for power, for praise. It was the same hunger that had filled his own heart for so long, the hunger that had denied him peace. He thought of the monk, who even now might be walking quietly in the palace gardens, unconcerned with borders, wealth, or titles. How strange, the king mused, that a man who owned nothing might sleep soundly, while a king surrounded by riches could not close his eyes. "Enough," the king said at last, raising his hand. The chamber fell silent, though the whispers lingered at the edges like restless birds. "I have heard your counsel, but tell me, Where in your words is compassion? Where in your plans is care for the people whose labor fills our granaries, whose sons march in our armies, whose daughters weave the very cloth upon your backs? The ministers shifted uneasily. Compassion was not a word often spoken in the royal court. Power, yes. Wealth, often. Fear, always. But compassion, to them it sounded almost childish, a dream too fragile for the harshness of rule. One minister bowed and spoke carefully. "My king, compassion is a noble virtue, but a ruler must be strong. Too much kindness invites weakness. Too much softness brings rebellion. The people must fear you, or they will not obey." The king's eyes grew heavy with thought. He remembered the monk's words. Strength may rule bodies, but it does not rule hearts. He wondered if his ministers truly served him, or only served themselves beneath the mask of loyalty. Later that day, as the court dispersed, the whispers began again. In corners and corridors, ministers spoke in secret tones. "The king has grown strange," one muttered. "He speaks of compassion like a dreamer." "Perhaps the monk has clouded his judgment," another said. "We must watch carefully, for if kindness becomes his law, our own power may suffer." Thus the seeds of doubt spread among them. And though they bowed before the king, behind closed doors they sharpened their plans like knives. That evening, the king sought the monk in the gardens. The air was warm, the sky painted with the colors of dusk. The monk sat quietly beneath a tree, watching the shadows grow long upon the grass. The king approached and sat beside him, lowering his voice. "Today, in my court, I spoke of compassion, yet my ministers looked at me as though I were a fool. They believe compassion is weakness. Tell me, monk, can compassion truly guide a kingdom?" The monk turned his gaze toward the fading light. "Great king, compassion is not weakness, but strength of a different kind. It is the strength that binds hearts, not chains. It is the strength that heals wounds, not deepens them. A kingdom ruled by fear may stand for a time, but it trembles in silence. A kingdom guided by compassion grows roots that no storm can tear away." The king listened, but doubt still clouded him. He thought of enemies beyond his borders, of ministers plotting within his palace, of whispers that never ceased. How could compassion silence such noise? The monk reached down and picked a fallen leaf, dry and brittle, in his hand. "See this leaf, my king? Once it was green, full of life, part of the great tree, but now it has withered, fallen, and soon it will turn to dust. All things in this world follow such a path: wealth, power, even life itself. To cling to them as if they were eternal is to suffer. But compassion does not wither, for it is not bound by possession. It flows from the heart, and when shared, it grows. This is why I own nothing, yet I am never poor." The king felt the weight of the leaf in his hand when the monk placed it there. He understood in some distant corner of his mind, but the whispers of the court still echoed louder than the monk's gentle words. That night, as he returned to his chamber, he passed by the doors of his ministers. Through the cracks he heard their murmurs, their plans, their endless hunger. He wondered whether any of them would ever understand compassion, or whether his kingdom would forever remain chained by fear as he lay in bed. The king's heart wrestled between two voices, the whispers of the court, sharp and restless, and the calm voice of the monk, soft and steady. Between these two, the king drifted into uneasy sleep, his dreams filled with shadows of war and faint glimmers of peace. The palace stood quiet beneath the moon, but within its walls, ambition never slept. The ministers schemed, the courtiers whispered, and the king dreamed of a world where compassion might yet take root. The story was far from over, for the tests to come would challenge not only the king's heart, but the strength of compassion itself. Part 3: The Greedy Neighbor. Beyond the mountains that framed the king's realm, there lay another kingdom, smaller in land yet heavy in ambition. Its ruler, known as the Neighbor King, was a man whose hunger for power burned hotter than fire. His palace was filled with golden treasures seized from those weaker than him, and his court was rich with flatterers who praised his every word. But no matter how much he gained, his heart was never satisfied. Greed gnawed at him day and night, whispering that more land, more wealth, more glory were needed to soothe the emptiness within. This neighbor king had long gazed with envious eyes upon the kingdom of the restless king. He saw its fertile fields stretching like green seas across the valleys. He saw its rivers flowing full and clear, feeding the crops and carrying trade to faraway lands. He heard of its people, strong and skillful, and he thought to himself, if these riches were mine, then perhaps I would finally feel whole. Yet deep down, he knew no treasure would fill his hunger, for greed is a thirst that drinks the ocean and remains dry. One evening, as the neighbor king dined in his glittering hall, he turned to his ministers. The table before him groaned with roasted meats, steaming breads, and goblets of wine that shimmered in the light of many torches. Yet his eyes were not on the food. They burned with longing as he spoke. The land of our neighbor grows rich. Their fields outshine ours, their rivers flow deeper, and their people multiply. Why should such wealth belong to another when it could be ours? Tell me, what do you propose? His ministers bowed low, their voices eager. One said, Great king, your armies are strong. With one swift strike, you could claim their land. Their people will serve you, and their riches will fill your coffers. Another added, Yes, their king grows soft. Rumor whispers that he speaks of compassion in his court, as if kindness could defend a throne. Now is the time to act, for weakness is our opportunity. The neighbor king smiled, though it was not a smile of joy, but one twisted by greed. He raised his goblet high and declared, Then we shall prepare. Soon their fields will be ours, their rivers ours, their people ours, and my name will shine brighter than theirs, for I will have everything they possess and more. The hall echoed with cheers. Yet beneath the noise, the silence of greed weighed heavily, though no one dared to notice. Meanwhile, in the palace of the restless king, days passed in uneasy rhythm. The monk remained calm, moving quietly through the gardens, speaking gently with those who crossed his path. Servants who once hurried about with tense shoulders found themselves breathing easier in his presence. Guards who stood stiff with duty softened their gaze when he greeted them. Even the children of the palace, who once played in shadows, now laughed more freely when the monk smiled at them. Compassion, though invisible, began to weave its quiet threads through the halls, yet the whispers of the court did not cease. Ministers grew restless, uneasy with the king's new interest in compassion. They feared it would weaken his rule, and in their fear they whispered louder, their words sharper. And among those whispers came troubling news. The neighbor king was gathering soldiers along the border. Messengers reported camps rising near the hills, weapons shining in the sun, drums beating in the night. The rumor of war spread like smoke, winding its way into every corner of the palace. The ministers came before the king, their faces pale with alarm. "My lord," one cried, "our neighbor prepares for war. We must answer with strength. Raise the armies, sharpen the swords, and let our enemies see that we are not weak." Another shouted, "Delay no longer. Strike first, or they will strike us. Compassion cannot shield us from spears." The king sat silently upon his throne, his hands folded, his brow heavy with thought. He remembered the monk's words, that fear rules bodies, but never hearts. Yet now his people were afraid, his ministers were panicked, and the shadow of invasion crept closer each day. Could compassion truly withstand the storm of war? That evening, the king sought the monk once more. He found him seated beside the fountain, watching the reflection of the stars ripple upon the water. The king lowered himself onto the stone bench and spoke with weary voice. "Monk, my neighbor gathers his armies. My court whispers of war. My people tremble, and even I feel the weight of fear. Tell me, how can compassion protect my kingdom against greed and spears?" The monk listened, his eyes calm as the still water. After a long silence, he spoke. "Great king, greed is a fire that consumes without end. To fight greed with greed is to add wood to the flames. To fight fear with fear is to let the fire spread. But to meet greed with compassion is to reveal the emptiness of its hunger. To meet fear with calm is to show a strength that weapons cannot break." The king shook his head. "But if my neighbor invades, my people will suffer. Must I not raise the sword to defend them?" The monk's gaze turned toward the fountain. "A sword may cut down an enemy, but it cannot cut down greed. A battle may silence drums for a season, but it does not silence envy. True defense lies not only in walls or armies, but in hearts that cannot be conquered. Rule your people with compassion, and they will stand with you, even in the darkest storm. Then, even if the neighbor king comes, he will find not weakness, but strength deeper than his greed can fathom." The king fell silent, for his heart was torn. He wanted to believe the monk's words, yet the drums on the border echoed louder each night. Meanwhile, in the neighbor king's court, the greed grew sharper. Spies returned with news that the restless king spoke of compassion, that his ministers doubted his resolve. The neighbor king laughed cruelly. "Then he is ripe for the taking. A soft heart cannot guard a throne. Soon his land will be mine." And so the neighbor king prepared his armies, his banners rising like dark clouds against the horizon. The soldiers marched, their armor clattering, their faces hardened by greed's command. But deep within their ranks, some hearts trembled. For though their king promised riches and glory, they knew that war brought sorrow, not peace. They remembered their families, their fields, their quiet homes, and wondered whether greed was worth the blood it demanded. Back in the palace of the restless king, the night grew heavy with tension. The whispers of the court became cries, urging for war. Yet in the stillness of the garden, the monk's voice carried like a gentle breeze. Greed may come with noise and fury, but compassion moves quietly, deeper than sound. Trust in compassion, and it will guide you. The king lay awake that night, torn between two worlds, the world of fear that whispered through his court, and the world of compassion that glowed like a faint light in his heart. He did not yet know which path he would choose, but he sensed that the coming days would test not only his throne, but the very essence of compassion itself. And so the shadow of the greedy neighbor crept closer, and the kingdom braced itself for what was to come. The story, like the night, was only deepening, and the dawn ahead would bring trials that neither king nor monk could avoid. Part 4. Small seeds of kindness. The days grew tense as the neighbor king's soldiers gathered along the border. Drums echoed faintly across the valleys, and the wind carried whispers of war to every village and town. Farmers who once tilled their fields with peace now looked anxiously toward the hills. Mothers hushed their children when they spoke too loudly of battles. Even the birds seemed to quiet their songs, as though sensing the unrest that spread through the land. Yet within the palace, where fear and suspicion had long reigned, something subtle was beginning to change. It was not announced by trumpets, nor decreed from the throne. It began softly, like the first shoots of grass after winter snow, so small that only those who looked closely could see. These were the small seeds of kindness, planted not by command, but by example, carried gently by the presence of the monk. The monk asked for nothing from the palace servants, yet he offered them simple words of gratitude. When a young page brought him water, the monk bowed his head and said, "Thank you for quenching my thirst." When a maid swept the floor of his small chamber, he smiled and whispered, "May your labor bring peace to your heart." These words, though plain, touched those who heard them, for few in the palace were ever noticed for their service. To be thanked was a rare gift, and from this gift, their own hearts began to soften. One evening, a guard stood watch at the garden gate. His armor was heavy, his feet weary, and his thoughts troubled by rumors of war. The monk approached him and offered a simple flower plucked from the garden. "Here," he said, "a reminder that beauty still blooms, even when the world grows heavy." The guard, surprised, accepted the flower. Though he said nothing, the weight of fear on his shoulders lightened, if only for a moment. He carried that flower tucked inside his armor through the night, and in his heart a small seed of calm was sown. These seeds spread quietly, from servant to guard, from guard to minister, from minister to king. The palace, once filled only with ambition and whispering tongues, now carried a faint warmth. The servants began to smile more at one another. The guards began to share food among themselves instead of hoarding. Even in the council chamber, where ministers quarreled endlessly, a few began to soften their voices, remembering the monk's gentle presence. The king himself felt this change most deeply, though his heart still wrestled with fear of the neighbor king's armies. He noticed how compassion, even in small acts, brought peace. He watched the monk's example and tried to follow in quiet ways. When a servant dropped a tray of goblets, spilling wine across the floor, the king once might have scolded in anger. But this time, he lifted his hand gently and said, "Do not be afraid. Accidents pass like clouds. Clean the floor and let it trouble you no more." The servant, stunned, bowed low, her eyes filled with tears of relief. Another day, when a minister argued fiercely for higher taxes to fund the army, the king listened patiently, then replied, "Tell me, What burden will this place upon the farmers who rise before dawn to feed us all? Have they not already given enough? Let us seek another way." The minister frowned, for such words threatened his wealth. But the others in the chamber felt a quiet stirring, as though compassion itself had taken a seat among them. Outside the palace, the seeds of kindness began to take root as well. Word of the monk's presence spread through the city. Merchants whispered of his gentle smile. Mothers spoke of how he blessed their children with kind words. Farmers who brought goods to the market heard stories of how the king, once stern and restless, now spoke with greater care. Though the drums of war thundered beyond the hills, within the kingdom a softer rhythm began to grow, rhythm of compassion. One evening, the king walked with the monk along the palace walls. From there, they could see the distant fires of the neighbor king's camps glowing upon the horizon. The sight filled the king with dread, yet beside him, the monk's steps were calm, his gaze steady upon the night sky. "Monk," the king said softly, "I do not understand. My enemies gather in great number. My court urges me to strike before they strike us. Yet you walk as though the world is at peace. How can you be so calm when danger draws near?" The monk paused and looked out over the fields below. "Great king, the world has always known danger. Storms come and go, fires burn and fade, wars rise and fall. To cling to fear is to fight every storm, every fire, every war before it arrives. But to rest in compassion is to know that even in darkness, the light of kindness endures. Calm does not ignore danger, it sees beyond it." The king lowered his gaze, thinking of the small acts of kindness he had seen. He thought of the guard with the flower, the servant with tears of relief, the ministers who softened their tone. If such small seeds could calm his palace, could they also calm a kingdom? And could they even soften the greed of his neighbor king? The days passed, and though the threat of war loomed ever closer, the seeds continued to grow. In villages, people began to share food more freely, remembering the king's words of compassion. Farmers who once competed fiercely began to help one another mend tools and plow fields. Mothers gathered to comfort one another's children when fear of soldiers spread. The kingdom, though anxious, began to draw closer together, as though compassion itself was weaving them into one. The neighbor king heard of these changes and grew enraged. His spies reported that the people of the kingdom were not trembling as expected. Instead, they were united, calm in spirit, even hopeful. The greedy king could not understand this. He had always ruled through fear, and fear had always bent people to his will. "How can they not cower?" he demanded. "How can they face my armies with peace in their hearts?" His ministers, equally confused, urged him to march quickly before this strange unity grew stronger. Back in the restless king's palace, the whispers of fear had not vanished, but they no longer ruled. The ministers still pressed for war, yet now their voices met resistance from those who had felt the touch of kindness. Even among them, seeds had taken root. A few began to question whether war was the only answer. Perhaps, they thought, compassion could be more than a dream. The king, watching all this unfold, realized that something profound was happening. The monk had not commanded armies or issued decrees, yet his quiet example had begun to transform the kingdom. Peace had not yet arrived, and danger still pressed upon their borders. But within the hearts of his people, the first blossoms of compassion had begun to bloom. That night, as the king lay upon his bed, he felt a change in his own heart. Though the weight of his crown still pressed upon him, though fear still whispered in the dark, he also felt a new strength rising. It was not the strength of swords or walls, but the strength of compassion, patient yet unshakable. He realized that the small seeds planted by kindness could grow into forests stronger than any army. And as he drifted into sleep, the king whispered to himself, "Perhaps compassion is not weakness, but the truest strength of all." Beyond the palace walls, the stars shone quietly over both kingdoms, as though waiting to see what the seeds of compassion would bring when tested by the storm of greed. Part 5. Shadows of Greed. The nights grew darker as the neighbor king's armies swelled along the border. Torches lit the hills in long lines of fire, and the pounding of war drums echoed like distant thunder across the valleys. Travelers who returned from the frontier spoke of restless soldiers sharpening swords and horses stamping the earth as if the ground itself trembled beneath their hooves. The shadow of greed stretched longer with each passing day, and though the kingdom of the restless king had begun to taste the sweetness of compassion, fear once again stirred in the hearts of many in the villages. Farmers whispered that invasion was certain. Some hid their grain, fearing armies would seize it. Merchants began hoarding goods, raising prices in case of siege. Parents drew their children close at night, praying the storm of war would pass them by. The seeds of kindness planted by the monk had not vanished, but the shadow of greed, heavy and suffocating, began to cover them. Within the neighbor king's palace, greed consumed every thought. He spent his days pacing his golden hall, imagining the riches that would soon be his. He spoke of new lands, new treasures, new subjects to bow at his feet. Yet the more he imagined, the hungrier he grew, for greed feeds not on satisfaction, but on endless desire. His ministers, eager to please him, fanned the flames, whispering of victories and spoils, never daring to remind him of the cost. One evening, as the neighbor king stood upon his balcony, he gazed across the dark horizon toward the kingdom he coveted. He clenched his fists and muttered, "Their land should be mine. Their rivers should flow for me. Their people should serve me. Only then will I be satisfied." But deep within, though he did not admit it, he knew no treasure could ever satisfy him. Greed had made his heart a bottomless pit, swallowing all without end. Back in the palace of the restless king, the council chamber was filled with unrest. Ministers argued bitterly, their voices sharp and urgent. Some demanded that armies be raised at once. Others urged heavy taxes to fund the war effort. A few, softened by the seeds of kindness, suggested patience and diplomacy, though their voices were drowned by the louder cries of fear. The king sat silently upon his throne, his mind torn between the clamor of his ministers and the calm memory of the monk's voice that night. Unable to bear the noise of the council, the king sought the monk in the garden once more. He found him seated quietly beneath a lantern, watching moths circle the flame. The king lowered himself onto the stone bench beside him and spoke in a heavy voice. "Monk, the shadow of greed grows darker each day. My people are afraid. My ministers cry out for war. Even I feel the weight pressing upon me, and my heart wavers. Tell me, how can compassion stand against such shadows?" The monk turned his gaze toward the moths, their fragile wings beating gently against the night. Great King Greed is like this flame. It burns brightly, drawing all who are near, yet it consumes itself as it consumes others. Those who chase greed are like moths. They see the light and rush toward it, but they do not see the fire that destroys them. Compassion is not a flame that burns, but a light that guides. It does not consume, it illuminates. The king sighed. But my neighbor gathers armies, not moths. He sharpens swords, not wings. If he marches against me, what then? Shall I meet his steel with words alone? The monk smiled gently. Compassion does not mean silence in the face of harm. It means seeing clearly, acting wisely, and remembering that even those consumed by greed are not beyond its reach. Defend your people, but do not let greed take root in your own heart. For if you fight with greed, you become like your neighbor, and the shadow will swallow you both. The king listened, but the fear in his heart remained. He returned to his chamber and lay upon his bed, the words of his ministers and the voice of the monk echoing together in his mind. He drifted into restless sleep, dreaming of fire and shadow, of armies clashing, and of a single flame flickering in the darkness. As days turned into weeks, the neighbor king grew impatient. He had expected his enemy to tremble, to surrender before the weight of his armies. Instead, he heard troubling rumors. Spies reported that the people of the restless king's land were not divided by fear as he had hoped. They were working together, sharing food, comforting one another, even preparing calmly for whatever might come. This angered him greatly. How can they remain calm in the face of war? He demanded. What trick is this? His ministers assured him that no trick could withstand an army, that once the swords clashed and the fires burned, the enemy would break. Yet still, the neighbor king felt unsettled, for greed thrives upon weakness, and the strength of compassion, though invisible, had begun to unsettle him. Within the restless king's kingdom, compassion continued to show its quiet strength. A farmer who had once hidden his grain decided to share with a neighbor whose fields had been flooded. A merchant lowered his prices to help families prepare for the uncertain days ahead. A soldier, seeing a child crying at the thought of war, knelt and offered his own meal with a gentle smile. These acts, small in themselves, carried a power greater than swords, for they bound the people together in unity. The king watched all this with wonder. Though the shadow of greed loomed larger each day, the seeds of kindness did not wither. They bent beneath the weight, but they did not break. He began to see that compassion was not fragile as he once thought. It was resilient, like a tree whose roots run deep, holding firm even in the storm. The neighbor king, blinded by greed, saw none of this. He mistook unity for weakness, compassion for softness, peace for fear. And so he prepared to march, his armies swelling with restless hunger, his heart consumed by shadows he could not escape. And as the shadow of greed stretched ever closer to the kingdom of compassion, the stage was set for a trial that would test both kings, the monk, and the very power of compassion itself. The night before the march, the restless king stood upon his balcony, gazing out at the distant fires of his neighbor's camp. His heart trembled, yet beneath the trembling, a calm strength stirred. He remembered the monk's words, the kindness of his people, the small seeds that had grown quietly all around him. And though the shadow pressed heavily upon him, he whispered to himself, "Compassion will not break. The stars shone silently overhead, watching as greed gathered its armies and compassion gathered its strength. The dawn to come would reveal which was greater, the consuming fire of greed or the steady light of compassion. Part 6. A great trial arrives. The dawn broke pale and heavy over the valley, the sky streaked with grey clouds that seemed to carry the weight of the coming trial. The neighbor king's armies, countless in number, began to stir. Soldiers tightened the straps of their armor, sharpened blades already sharp, and mounted restless horses. Drums rolled like thunder, and the sound carried far across the fields, reaching even the ears of the people in distant villages. The shadow that had hovered for so long now began to move, and the great trial of the restless king and his people had arrived. In the palace, the ministers were frantic. Some argued for immediate battle, urging the king to ride out with his armies and meet the invaders with fire and steel. Others whispered that surrender might spare the kingdom destruction, though it would cost their freedom. The council chamber was filled with fear, each voice rising above the other, until the noise became a storm of desperation. The king sat upon his throne, silent amidst the chaos. His eyes were weary, yet steady. He remembered the monk's words. To fight greed with greed was to be consumed, but to meet it with compassion was to reveal its emptiness. Still, he knew the test before him was greater than words alone. His people looked to him for guidance, and the armies at his command waited for his order. That evening, as the sun sank low and painted the horizon with fire, the king went once more to the garden where the monk sat in quiet meditation. The air was still, heavy with the scent of blossoms and the weight of unspoken fears. The king lowered himself onto the bench beside him and spoke softly. "Monk, the hour has come. My neighbor marches upon us. My ministers cry for war. My people tremble. I do not know how to hold to compassion when the storm of greed is upon us." The monk opened his eyes slowly, his gaze calm as the twilight. "Great king, a storm tests the roots of every tree. Some fall, some bend, some endure. Compassion is not the absence of trial, it is the strength to remain rooted, even when the winds roar. Do not seek to destroy your neighbor, for in destroying him you destroy yourself. Instead, show him the emptiness of his greed. Let compassion guide not only your heart, but your actions." The king listened, his heart torn between fear and faith. "But how can I show compassion to an enemy who comes with swords? Will he not see it as weakness?" The monk smiled faintly. "Perhaps, but compassion has a power he cannot understand. It is not weakness to stand unshaken in the face of violence. It is not weakness to protect your people without hatred. Whatever he sees, let your heart remain pure. Shadows cannot last where light endures." The king breathed deeply, and for a moment, calm entered him. He rose, thanked the monk, and returned to the palace to prepare. The following morning, the restless king led his army to the field. His soldiers were fewer than his neighbors, yet their eyes were steadier, their steps more certain. They marched not with hatred, but with resolve to protect their homes and families. Farmers left their plows to stand beside soldiers, not out of greed, but out of loyalty and love for their land. The seeds of kindness planted in the days before now bore fruit. For unity had taken root, and fear was softened by compassion. Across the valley, the neighbor king's army darkened the earth, a sea of iron and banners. He rode at the front, his crown gleaming in the sunlight, his eyes burning with greed. He raised his sword high and shouted, "Today we take what is ours. Today their land becomes mine." His soldiers roared, though many hearts trembled. For greed does not inspire true loyalty, only commands obedience born of fear. The two armies faced each other as silence fell, broken only by the restless snorting of horses and the distant caw of crows. The restless king rode forward, raising his hand. His soldiers halted, their eyes fixed on him. He did not draw his sword. Instead, he spoke, his voice carrying across the field. "People of my land, and people of my neighbor's land, hear me. I do not stand here to destroy you. I stand here to protect those I love. We will not bow to greed, nor will we surrender to fear. But we do not hate you. We do not wish for your suffering. We stand with compassion, for even in war, we remember that every soldier is a son, a father, a brother, a friend." His words, simple yet steady, rippled through his ranks. His people raised their voices in answer, not with cries of hatred, but with chants of unity. Their strength was not in the sharpness of their blades, but in the bond that tied their hearts together. The neighbor king laughed bitterly at these words. "Foolish king," he shouted, his voice harsh with scorn. "Your compassion will be your ruin. Your softness will be your downfall. My armies will crush you, and your people will kneel at my feet." He raised his sword, and the drums thundered. His soldiers began to advance, the ground shaking beneath their march. The battle began. Steel clashed against steel, and the air filled with the cries of men and the pounding of hooves. Dust rose like smoke, blinding eyes and choking breath. Yet amid the chaos, something unusual was seen. The soldiers of the restless king fought bravely, but not with cruelty. They defended their ground, but when enemies fell, they spared those who no longer raised their swords. Some even lifted the wounded from the earth, carrying them out of harm's way, friend and foe alike. Compassion guided their hands, even in the heat of battle. The neighbor king's soldiers, hardened by fear, expected only hatred, but when met with mercy, their hearts faltered. Some lowered their weapons, confused. Others began to question the cause for which they fought. For while fear can drive men into war, compassion can awaken their hidden humanity. The neighbor king, watching from his horse, grew enraged. "Fight harder," he shouted. "Do not falter. Crush them, or you will face my wrath." But the more he demanded, the weaker his command became. For fear may bind bodies, but it cannot bind hearts forever. As the sun climbed high, the battle reached its peak. The restless king, though weary, stood firm, his voice carrying encouragement to his people. "Hold fast, protect one another, remember compassion." His words gave strength where swords could not. At last, the neighbor king himself rode forward, seeking to end the battle by striking down his rival. He charged across the field, his sword flashing, his crown glinting with greed. The restless king met him, not with hatred, but with steady resolve. Their eyes locked, one burning with greed, the other calm with compassion. They clashed, and the sound rang out like thunder. Blow after blow, the neighbor king struck, his strength driven by hunger. Yet the restless king, though less fierce, stood unshaken. He parried with care, not seeking to destroy, but to endure at last. The neighbor king's sword was struck from his hand, and he fell to the earth. The restless king stood over him, his own blade raised. Silence fell across the battlefield. The neighbor king glared up, expecting death. Yet what he saw was not hatred, but mercy. The restless king lowered his sword. "Your greed has brought us here," he said, his voice clear for all to hear. "But it will not guide my hand. I will not become like you. I will not let compassion be swallowed by shadows. Rise, if you will, but know this: compassion is stronger than greed, and mercy is greater than conquest." The neighbor king trembled, for in that moment he felt the emptiness of his hunger. His soldiers, watching, began to lower their weapons. The battle quieted, not through slaughter, but through the unexpected strength of compassion. The trial had arrived. And though the wounds of war scarred the field, the light of compassion had not been extinguished. In the heart of the restless king, and in the hearts of his people, it burned brighter than before, showing the world that even in the darkest hour, compassion can stand unbroken. Part 7. Help arrives unexpectedly. The battlefield lay quiet in the fading light of evening. Dust hung in the air, and the cries of men slowly gave way to silence. Soldiers from both sides stood still, their weapons lowered, their eyes fixed upon the two kings. The restless king, steady and calm, had spared his rival when the sword was in his hand. The neighbor king, once fierce and burning with greed, now sat upon the earth, shaken not by the force of blows, but by the mercy that had disarmed him. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the restless king turned to his soldiers and spoke. "Gather the wounded. Care for them, whether friend or foe. Tonight we will remember not victory, but compassion." His voice carried across the valley, gentle yet commanding, and his people obeyed. Soldiers who only moments ago clashed in anger now bent together to lift the fallen. Water was shared, bandages torn from cloaks, and words of comfort spoken between men who once called each other enemies. The neighbor king watched all this in disbelief. Never had he seen mercy shown in the midst of war. He expected cruelty, conquest, triumph shouted from bloodied lips. Instead, he saw compassion spread like quiet fire, warming even the most hardened of hearts. Something deep inside him stirred an unfamiliar weight that was not greed, but shame. He lowered his eyes, unable to meet the gaze of the man who had spared him as the night deepened. The battlefield became a camp where enemies lay side by side, tended by hands that no longer cared for borders. Fires burned, not to destroy, but to warm. Silence settled, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the quiet murmurs of care. Above them, the stars shone bright and clear, as though bearing witness to a truth long hidden, that even in war, compassion could prevail. The restless king walked among the men, speaking softly, lifting spirits, thanking his soldiers for their courage. When he passed a group of the neighbor king's soldiers, he knelt beside them and offered water with his own hand. They looked at him with astonishment, for they had been taught that kings were distant, proud, and merciless. Yet here was a king whose strength lay not in fear, but in kindness. In that moment, something unexpected began to happen. The neighbor king's men, weary and broken, began to whisper among themselves. Some spoke of laying down arms forever. Others vowed quietly that they would no longer follow a master who led them only through greed. Seeds of doubt grew within their ranks, and with them, seeds of hope. But the help that was to come had not yet revealed itself. It arrived not in armies or weapons, but in ways no one could have foretold. The following day, as the sun rose over the valley, a procession appeared upon the road. It was not an army, but a group of villagers, men and women from nearby towns, carrying baskets of food, jars of water, and cloth for bandages. They had heard of the battle, of the king's mercy, of compassion shown where cruelty was expected. And so they came, not to fight, but to help. The soldiers watched in awe as the villagers moved among them, offering bread to the hungry, tending to the wounded, speaking words of comfort. They did not ask whether a man was friend or enemy. They only saw human faces, weary and in pain. Their kindness poured into the valley like fresh rain upon dry soil. The neighbor king, still shaken, watched from a distance. He could not understand. Why would simple villagers risk themselves to aid those who might have destroyed them? Why would they show kindness when fear could have kept them safe? He felt the ground beneath his certainty begin to tremble. The monk, who had quietly walked onto the battlefield at dawn, approached the neighbor king. He bowed gently and said, "Do you see, great king? Compassion is not bound by thrones or crowns. It flows through the hearts of all, even those you would call common. This is the help that arrives when compassion leads. It does not march with swords, but with open hands. It does not conquer by force, but by love." The neighbor king's eyes filled with confusion, but also with a glimmer of awakening. He felt for the first time that his greed had blinded him to a truth deeper than all the treasures he had ever sought. As the day passed, more help arrived. Monks from distant monasteries came, carrying herbs and prayers. Farmers brought grain from their fields, bakers loaves from their ovens, healers their simple tools. One by one, they joined the work of mending rather than breaking, of healing rather than harming. The battlefield, once a place of destruction, began to resemble a vast sanctuary where enemies were no longer divided but united by shared suffering and shared care. The restless king looked upon this sight with wonder. He had feared that compassion would not be strong enough to defend his land. Yet now he saw that it had done more than defend, it had transformed. His people stood taller, not because of victories won, but because of hearts strengthened by unity. The neighbor king's soldiers, once driven by fear, now looked upon the restless king with respect, even admiration. Many of them no longer wished to return to the service of greed. That evening, as the fires flickered under the stars, the neighbor king approached the restless king. His steps were slow, his eyes lowered. For the first time in many years, he bowed, not out of fear, but out of humility. "You spared me when you could have ended me," he said softly. "And now your people, your monks, your villagers, they show kindness even to those who came to destroy them. I do not understand such strength, but I cannot deny what I see. My greed has brought me nothing but emptiness. Your compassion has brought you a kingdom united. Tell me, what is this power you hold?" The restless king placed a hand upon his shoulder. "It is no power of mine alone. It is compassion, which belongs to all who choose it. Greed divides, but compassion unites. Greed devours, but compassion nourishes. This is the strength you have not yet known." Tears welled in the neighbor king's eyes, though he tried to hide them. He felt as though a great weight he had carried for years was finally breaking. The hunger within him, though not yet gone, no longer felt like command, but like a wound that longed to heal. The monk, standing nearby, added softly, "Help often arrives when least expected. Sometimes it comes from strangers, sometimes from enemies, sometimes from within your own heart. It is the nature of compassion to appear where greed cannot imagine it. Look around you, and you will see that you are not alone. If only you choose to see." The neighbor king lifted his eyes and, for the first time, saw not enemies, but human faces of those who had suffered by his command, yet who still offered him water, still tended to his wounded men, still shared bread from their baskets. His heart trembled, for such help was more powerful than any army he had ever led. As night deepened, the two kings walked side by side across the camp. Soldiers from both sides watched them, whispering in wonder. Some felt as though they were seeing the birth of a new world, one not ruled by fear or greed, but by something gentler, stronger, and more enduring. The great trial had not yet ended, but help had arrived in a form no one expected, not in reinforcements of steel, but in reinforcements of compassion. And in that help, both kings were beginning to see a path beyond the shadows of greed. The stars glimmered above, steady and eternal, as though reminding them that true strength lies not in crowns or armies, but in the small, steady acts of kindness that light the darkest nights. Part 8. The Fall of the Greedy. The night passed quietly over the valley that only hours before had been filled with the clash of steel and the thunder of drums. Fires burned low, keeping watch over the wounded who slept side by side, no longer enemies but weary men in need of rest. Villagers moved softly among them, bringing water, bread, and gentle words. For the first time in memory, a battlefield was transformed into a place of healing rather than conquest. The neighbor king lay awake in his tent, though his body was heavy with exhaustion. His mind was unsettled, stirred not by dreams of treasure as before, but by images of mercy. He saw again the face of the restless king, sparing him when victory was certain. He remembered the villagers who had brought bread even for his soldiers, though they had come to destroy. He felt the weight of the monk's words, reminding him that compassion was a light greed could never understand. His crown lay beside him, gleaming faintly in the firelight, but it no longer looked to him like glory. It looked like chains. At dawn, he rose and walked alone across the camp. His soldiers stirred, surprised to see him without guards. Some bowed, but their bows were hesitant, uncertain. He could feel if their loyalty had shifted. No longer did they follow him with fear in their hearts. Many looked instead toward the restless king, who walked among his people like a father among children, speaking softly, sharing bread, tending to wounds with his own hands. The neighbor king realized with growing dread that his soldiers saw more strength in compassion than they had ever seen in his greed. By midday, the whispers became clear. Groups of his men gathered not to plan conquest but to question. Why do we fight for a king who cares only for himself? One said, "Look at their king. He protects his people and even spares his enemies. Is that not the kind of man worth following?" The neighbor king heard these whispers wherever he walked, and they cut him deeper than any sword. Desperate to hold on to power, he called his ministers to his side. "We must act quickly," he hissed. My men are wavering. Spread word that their compassion is weakness, that it will doom them all. Tell them greed is strength, that conquest is glory. Remind them of the treasures that await if we press forward. But even as the ministers obeyed, their words fell upon ears already softened. Soldiers who had been shown kindness could no longer believe that cruelty was strength. Men who had tasted mercy no longer found hunger for plunder appealing. The ministers themselves, seeing the rising tide of compassion, began to question the king they served. The neighbor king's grip upon them weakened with every breath. When he returned to his tent that night, the neighbor king found the monk waiting for him. The old man sat calmly, his hands resting upon his knees, his eyes steady. "You are restless, great king," the monk said softly. "You fear not your enemy, but your own heart." The neighbor king glared, though his anger was hollow. "My soldiers doubt me. My ministers whisper against me. My power slips away. And all because of this. Compassion you speak of. It poisons their loyalty. It unravels everything I built." The monk shook his head gently. "What you built was never lasting. You built upon fear, and fear is sand. You built upon greed, and greed is fire. Fear crumbles, and fire consumes. Compassion, however, is like the earth firm beneath the storm, steady beneath the flame. You see its strength now, though it is not yours to command. It is only yours to choose." The neighbor king sank to the ground, his hands clutching his crown. Tears he had long denied filled his eyes. "I do not know how," he whispered. "Greed has ruled me all my life. Without it, what am I?" "You are simply a man," the monk replied. "No greater, no lesser than any other. You have the same choice all men have, to cling to shadows, or to step into light." The crown felt heavier than stone in the neighbor king's hands. He remembered the treasures he had seized, the palaces he had filled, the subjects who bowed only because they feared. And now, standing in the presence of compassion, all of it seemed hollow, meaningless, fading like smoke in the wind. The next morning, he mounted his horse and rode out to the center of the battlefield. Soldiers from both sides watched in silence as he dismounted, carrying his crown in both hands. He walked to the restless king and bowed low, pressing the crown into the dust at his feet. His voice broke as he spoke. "I can no longer carry this weight. Greed has consumed me, and I see now it has left me empty. You have shown me mercy where I deserved none. Teach me how to walk in compassion, for I no longer wish to rule with shadows." A murmur swept across the field. The restless king looked down at the man who had once threatened his land with fire. Slowly, he bent and lifted him to his feet. "Your fall is not your end," he said. "If you choose compassion, you rise again, not as a king of greed, but as a man reborn. The path will not be easy, but it is open to you." The soldiers, seeing their king bow and surrender his crown, felt the last chains of fear break. Some wept openly. Others dropped their weapons, no longer willing to fight for greed. The ministers who had once served the neighbor king fell silent, ashamed of the lies they had told. And the people of the restless king's land, watching from the hills, saw with their own eyes the fall of greed and the triumph of compassion. The neighbor king's fall was not marked by his death, nor by conquest, but by surrender to truth. His crown once a symbol of power, now lay forgotten in the dust. And yet, in losing it, he gained something far greater: a chance to change, to live, to walk a different path. That evening, as the two kings sat together beside the fires, the monk spoke once more. Remember this, both of you. Power built on fear will always fall. Power built on greed will always collapse. But compassion endures, even when kingdoms fade. For compassion does not rule through crowns or armies, but through the quiet strength of hearts awakened. The neighbor king listened with bowed head, his heart heavy yet strangely lighter than it had ever been. He knew his greed had brought suffering to many, and he would carry that weight forever. But he also knew that compassion had offered him a chance to begin again. And so, the fall of the greedy was not the end of a man, but the end of his shadows. What would rise from that fall was yet to be seen, but the lesson was clear to all who witnessed it. Greed devours. Compassion redeems. The stars shone brightly overhead that night, as if the heavens themselves had witnessed the turning of a tide. And in the quiet valley, where once only shadows ruled, the light of compassion glowed steady, guiding the hearts of kings, soldiers, and villagers alike, toward a dawn beyond greed. Part 9: Awakening Through Suffering. The valley lay calm in the days after the battle, where once armies clashed and dust choked the air. Now fires burned only for warmth, and voices carried not cries of war, but whispers of care. The neighbor king's crown still lay where he had pressed it into the dust, a symbol of greed surrendered, of shadows broken. Yet though the moment had passed into peace, his heart was far from settled. He awoke each morning heavy with shame. The faces of men who had fallen by his command haunted him. He saw mothers grieving, villages burned in past conquests, lives torn apart so his treasures might grow. Now that the fever of greed had broken, the memories rushed in like floodwaters, drowning him in sorrow. He no longer walked with the proud stride of a conqueror, but with the bent shoulders of a man burdened by regret. His soldiers, once bound to him by fear, no longer looked at him the same. Some pitied him, others turned away in silence. Ministers who had flattered him now distanced themselves, unwilling to share in his fall. The weight of his choices pressed upon him, and though compassion had spared his life, he felt as though he carried the ashes of all he had destroyed. One evening, as the camp quieted beneath the stars, he approached the monk. His eyes were hollow, his voice trembling. "You spoke of compassion as a light, yet I feel only darkness. I see the suffering my greed has caused, and it crushes me. Tell me, how can compassion heal wounds so deep? How can it forgive what I cannot forgive myself for?" The monk looked upon him with gentle eyes. "Suffering is the mirror of our past. You see now what greed blinded you from before. Do not turn away from this pain, for within it lies awakening. Just as fire can destroy a forest, it also clears the ground for new growth. Let your suffering teach you, and let compassion guide you through it. The path will not be easy, but it is the only path that leads to peace." The neighbor king bowed his head, tears falling freely. For the first time in many years, he did not hide them. He felt raw, exposed, stripped of titles and pride. And yet, in the honesty of his suffering, he felt a small stirring, a faint sense that perhaps this pain could be more than punishment. Perhaps it could be the beginning of something new in the days that followed. He chose to walk among the wounded, tending them with his own hands. At first, the men recoiled, unable to believe that the same king who had driven them to war would now bind their wounds. But the monk encouraged him, "Do not expect trust at once. Compassion grows slowly, like seeds in the soil. Water them with sincerity, and in time they will bloom." So the neighbor king fetched water, carried food, and stayed at the bedsides of those in pain. He spoke little, for he felt unworthy of words, but his hands worked steadily. Some rejected him, turning their faces away. Others accepted silently. Slowly, day by day, the bitterness around him began to soften. One soldier, his leg broken and his spirit heavy, whispered, "Why do you serve me when I served you and you led me to ruin?" The neighbor king bowed his head and replied, "Because I cannot undo the past, but I can choose compassion now." Tears filled the soldier's eyes, and he reached out to take his king's hand. It was a small moment, but it struck deep within the neighbor king's heart. The suffering did not end there. When the neighbor king returned to his own land weeks later, he was met not with celebration, but with silence. His people, weary of endless wars and heavy taxes, no longer cheered at his approach. Instead, they watched cautiously, waiting to see whether the man who had once consumed their lives for greed had truly changed. He felt their doubt as a knife, but he did not turn away. Instead, he humbled himself, walking through the streets without soldiers, without fanfare. Bowing his head to those he had wronged, he reopened granaries once hoarded for himself and ordered the food, shared freely among the poor. He released prisoners taken unjustly during his conquests, bowing to them as they walked free. He sold treasures from his palace to rebuild villages his wars had burned. Each act cost him pride. Each act deepened his suffering, for it reminded him of the harm he had caused. Yet with each act, he felt something slowly shifting inside her, weightlifting. Not all at once, but piece by piece. His ministers whispered that he had gone mad. They feared losing their own power and wealth, for compassion threatened to undo the web of greed they had long benefited from. Some plotted against him, hoping to restore the old ways. But the people, though cautious, began to see the truth of his actions. Trust did not bloom quickly, but tiny shoots began to break through the soil of doubt. One night, he dreamt of his crown lying in the dust. He reached for it, but when his hand touched it, it crumbled into ash. He awoke shaken, yet strangely relieved. He realized that the crown had never been his true weight, it was his greed. Now that greed had fallen, he could live not as a king of fear, but as a servant of compassion. The suffering did not disappear, deepened. For awakening is not escape from pain, but the clear seeing of it. He wept often, sometimes in solitude, sometimes in the presence of the monk who visited him. Each tear was a confession of a life wasted in hunger that never ended. But each tear also watered the seeds of new compassion within him. The monk told him, "Do not run from your suffering. Sit with it. Learn from it. Let it soften you until you can look even your greatest enemy in the eye and see not hatred, but shared humanity." And so, the neighbor king learned that awakening through suffering is not a sudden light, but a slow dawn. Each ray breaking through the clouds until the whole sky begins to glow. His people, once silent, began to see this dawn in him. They saw a man who no longer demanded tribute, but worked alongside them in fields. They saw a ruler who walked among the poor, not above them. They saw a king who had fallen, yet in his fall had risen higher than greed could ever lift him. His suffering did not vanish, but it became his teacher. Through it, he awakened to the truth that greed destroys and compassion heals. And though the scars of his past would never fully fade, they became reminders of the path he had walked, the path that had led him from shadows into light. In the kingdom of the restless king, word spread of the transformation. People marveled that even one so lost in greed could awaken through suffering. The restless king himself felt renewed, for he saw in his former enemy the living proof that compassion's strength was greater than any sword. Together they met once more, not as rivals, but as men humbled by life's trials, and as they spoke beneath the shade of an old tree, the monk said softly, "This is the way of the world. Suffering comes to all, but in suffering lies the chance for awakening. Shadows fall, but light returns. Greed dies, but compassion endures." The two kings bowed their heads, understanding at last that the truest victory was not conquest of others, but conquest of the self. Part 1. The eternal lesson seasons passed across the valley where armies once clashed. The grass grew tall again, hiding the scars of battle. Villages rebuilt, rivers flowed clear, and children's laughter returned to fields once darkened by the smoke of war. Time, like a gentle hand, covered the wounds of the land, though the memory of suffering lingered in the hearts of those who had lived through it. The neighbor, king, no longer draped in jewels or carried high on gilded thrones, lived now with a quiet humility. He had not abandoned his crown entirely, but he wore it rarely, keeping it more as a reminder of the weight it once carried than as a symbol of power. His court, once filled with greedy ministers, had thinned, for many who clung to shadows had fled. Those who remained were men and women willing to walk a new path of service rather than self-interest. He spent his days not in conquest but in rebuilding. He walked the fields with farmers, bent his back alongside them at harvest. He shared meals from the same clay bowls as his people, listened to their stories, and offered what comfort he could. His past could not be erased, but each act of kindness was like a stone laid carefully upon a broken wall, mending piece by piece what greed had torn down. The restless king, too, had changed. Once haunted by sleepless nights, he now found rest more easily. Though the burdens of rule never left him, he had learned that compassion lightened them. He governed not only with laws, but with listening, not only with strength, but with mercy. His people trusted him more deeply, for they knew he valued not only their labor, but their lives. And in his heart, the monk's words still echoed, guiding him through doubt and trial. One evening, many months after the battle, the two kings met again on the hill where their armies had once stood facing one another. The sun was setting, painting the sky with gold and crimson. The air was quiet, filled only with the hum of insects and the rustle of grass in the wind. They sat together upon the earth, no thrones, no banners, only two men who had been shaped by the weight of their choices. The neighbor king spoke first. "I never thought I would see this day when I could sit beside you, not as an enemy, but as a friend. My greed led me to shame, my shame to suffering, and my suffering to awakening. Yet I fear the shadows still linger. What if they return?" The restless king looked at him with gentle eyes. shadows always return. Fear returns, greed returns, anger returns. But so too does compassion. The lesson is not to destroy shadows forever, but to know that light endures beyond them. Even when darkness rises, we can choose to keep the flame of compassion alive. The neighbor king bowed his head. Then perhaps my fall was necessary. Without it, I would never have seen the emptiness of greed. It is suffering that opened my eyes. The monk, who would quietly approach and now sat beside them, spoke softly. And so you both see the eternal lesson. Empires rise and fall, crowns shine and tarnish, greed grows and consumes. But compassion endures, passed from one heart to another, from one generation to the next. It is not bound by kings or kingdoms. It is the thread that weaves humanity together, stronger than steel, softer than silk, eternal as the sky. They sat in silence, letting his words settle. The wind carried the scent of earth and grass, the song of birds returning to their nests. In that stillness, both kings felt a peace deeper than victory, deeper than pride, a peace born of compassion that asked nothing in return. As night fell, villagers gathered at the foot of the hill, carrying lanterns that glowed softly in the dark. They came not out of fear, nor to bow before rulers, but to join in a quiet vigil of gratitude. Families who had once been divided by war now stood side by side. Soldiers who had faced each other with swords now shared bread and song. The monk spoke once more to all who gathered, his voice steady and gentle. Remember always this truth. Greed may rise like fire, fierce and consuming, but it burns itself out. Compassion rises like water, gentle yet enduring, shaping even the hardest stone. Let your lives be rivers of compassion, flowing through your homes, your villages, your kingdoms. Teach your children that true strength lies not in conquest, but in kindness. Let this lesson live beyond us, so that when shadows come again, as they surely will, the light of compassion will guide the way. The people bowed their heads, and the lanterns flickered like stars upon the earth. The neighbor king wept openly, but these were not tears of shame. They were tears of release, of gratitude, of a man who had finally laid down the hunger that had consumed him. The restless king placed a hand upon his shoulder, steady and warm. You have fallen, but in your fall you found the ground upon which to rise again. That is the gift of suffering when met with compassion. And so the eternal lesson was sealed, not in stone or scroll, but in the hearts of all who witnessed it. The story of the two kings and the monks spread far and wide, carried by travelers and told by firesides. Some spoke of it as a tale of mercy, others as a parable of greed's downfall. But those who truly listened knew it was more than a story of kings. It was a story of every soul. For in each life there are crowns of pride, shadows of greed, nights of suffering, and the choice to awaken through compassion. Years later, when the monk had long since passed into silence, when the crowns of both kings had been set aside, the story remained. Children grew up hearing it, learning that kindness is strength and that compassion outlives all shadows. Villages flourished, not because wars ceased forever, but because the memory of compassion lived within their people. And even now, as the stars shine above new generations, the eternal lesson whispers through time that though greed may fall, compassion will always rise, steady as the dawn, eternal as the sky. And so, dear listener, the story of the monk and the two kings comes to a quiet close. What began with fear and restlessness, with the heavy weight of crowns and the endless hunger of greed, ended in a lesson as soft as it is enduring. Compassion outlives all shadows. The restless king found rest not through conquest, but through mercy. The greedy king fell, yet in his fall he awakened to a truth far greater than any treasure. And the monk, patient and gentle, showed that wisdom does not need armies or jewels, only a heart steady enough to shine like a lamp in the darkness. Perhaps as you lie here now, listening to the soft rhythm of this tale, you too feel the echoes of their journey. We all know what it means to carry heavy burdens, to feel restless even in comfort, to chase desires that never quite satisfy. And we all know what it is to stumble, to suffer, to awaken slowly through pain. The kings in this story are not so different from us. They remind us that in every moment we have the choice to be consumed by shadows of fear and greed, or to let compassion guide us back into light. Compassion is not weakness. It is not surrender. It is the quiet strength that unites, the gentle hand that heals, the voice that softens anger and reminds us of our shared humanity. It is in small acts, a kind word, a patient breath, a moment of understanding. These small seeds grow into forests that no storm can tear down. And even when greed rises again, as it surely will in the world and in our hearts, compassion will always be there to meet it, calm and steady. So as you drift into sleep, let this story rest within you like a gentle flame. Imagine the monk's calm smile, the restless king finally finding peace, and even the greedy king learning to bow his head and rise again through compassion. Let these images soften your thoughts, quiet your worries, and carry you into dreams where kindness guides your steps. And when you wake tomorrow, carry a little of this lesson with you. Speak gently where you might be harsh. Choose patience where you might rush. Offer kindness where it may not be expected. In doing so, you become part of this story, part of the eternal lesson that compassion is stronger than greed, and mercy greater than conquest. If this story has brought you comfort, if it has helped you find calm and rest tonight, I invite you to stay with us. Subscribe to Buddhism for Sleep, and return whenever you wish to hear more timeless tales of wisdom, compassion, and peace. Together, we can create a quiet sanctuary where stories soothe the heart and guide us gently into sleep. Close your eyes now. Breathe deeply. Let go of the day. May compassion guide you into rest, and may your dreams be filled with peace.